The late 80s and the 90s were a different time for games. Nintendo and Sega were still the giants fighting for the control of the console market, with Sony just lurking around the corner ready to take both of them down with the release of the PlayStation. Arcades were still popular, with arcade machines getting the better versions of many games due to the limitations of the hardware found in consoles. Players had to figure everything out by themselves, or wait for a magazine to release a guide on the game that they were playing. And Blockbuster was the place you go to rent games, as well as your Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer movie for Christmas, only to instead find some random movie inside of it and be completely disappointed and never really get a chance to watch this movie again until you were already an adult. And still remember how you got screwed at one time, so you got kinda pissed off, not at the movie itself, but at the memory attached to it. I'm not mad about it, random jerk that swapped movies. I just hope you're safe and healthy, and nothing wrong ever happens to your family and you. Games during that time were much simpler, both due to technical limitations and developer inexperience. The addition of features which in retrospect were quite simple and might seem like no-brainers now, could mean a significant revolution in the way that games were developed. Which means that a lot of the games released during this era are some of the most influential games ever, having warped the game industry in some way or another. They are also some of the most beloved games, being the first experiences that many people had with video games. The nostalgia attached to these games, as well as the valuable game design lessons that might have been lost to some game companies over the years, have propelled some developers to try to recapture the magic of the earlier days of video games, spawning a wave of multiple retro titles. The phenomenon started with indie devs publishing their games that pay homage to older games, and now it has intensified to the point where some of the most popular games of the 5 last years or so are retro-styled. This, combined with the power of the internet's nearly limitless memory and emulators, has propelled many younger players to check out some of the older classics of gaming, and see what they missed out on. The interest over old games and consoles, as well as their affordability, have grown exponentially over the years, now being the highest it's ever been. Some discontinued consoles even got re-releases for those who wish to buy them on more affordable prices, and some of the developers creating retro games have started making them not only for PC and newer consoles, but also for the old consoles of their preference. One example of this is Micromages, raising €150,000 on Kickstarter and released in 2019 for the NES and on Steam. This game makes you part of the The game pays homage to multiple classic NES titles, and was developed with a multiplayer in mind, as seen by the fact that upon booting up the game, you can choose the number of players in the game. The gameplay is very straightforward. It's a platformer with controls akin to Mega Man, while also featuring wall jumps that makes the platforming incredibly fun and opens up a lot of possibilities for the players to perfect it, creating the potential for a great game for speedruns. As players progress through the levels, the map scrolls up with them, making being too slow lethal. Getting hit once without the power-ups is also fatal. The power-ups are much like Mario's, with one of them making it possible to tank an extra hit and the other one being a cute duckling that allows players to float a little and will take a hit for the players if they are in harm's way. On co-op mode, if a player dies, the game is not over, and instead they can help their friends as ghosts. Throughout the levels, players will find a variety of enemies with unique attacking patterns. The difficulty slowly ramps up with each stage by adding more inconvenient enemies, but it's nothing too hard. The points in the game serve no real purpose other than giving you a slight idea of how well you're doing. There's no practical use to it. So if you don't care at all, you can just jump as fast as your heart contends with no real consequences. Upon completion of each stage in classic retro game fashion, players get a password to skip to that level, should they turn off their console or close the game. After completing the 13 stages of the game, players unlock hard mode, in which enemies now gain different attacks. The enemies are some of the most common minions of evil types, with skeletons being the most common. The level design is simple but effective. The reason for the simplicity of the stages and the enemies of the game is explained by the fact that the developers had to reuse many graphics and animations to fit the game into a 40 kilobyte size, which was the size of games when the NES was released. 8 bytes were used for graphics and 32 for coding, and the game is coded in 6502 assembly. All of these to keep the game true to the theme of the NES era. The developers made an in-depth explanation video, which I'll link in the description. Micromages is one of the best examples of a game made in recent years to be compatible with old consoles. It is executed exceptionally well, to the point that it could pass for a real retro gen, lost in time, should one not know its actual release date. It's also an incredibly fun and simple game, making it perfect for retro enthusiasts who just want to play a game and relax. While Micromages lets you play and chill, Xeno Crisis is a game with no chill. The game was released in 2019 for the Sega Genesis and later released on Steam, Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, Dreamcast, PlayStation Vita, Neo Geo CD, Nintendo 64, GameCube and SNES. And probably going to be soon released on a calculator as well. Xeno Crisis is an arena multi-dimensional shooter, with the premise that a scientific research facility in space is being overrun by aliens, and you, as either one of the suspiciously named Space Marines John Marsh and Sarah Ridley, are deployed to deal with this...
Xeno Crisis.
Yeah, the namesake couldn't be more in your face. While the room structures, the perspective and the movement of the game are heavily reminiscent of Smash TV, the art style and some of the gameplay mechanics feel similar to Metal Slug. The gameplay is deceptively simple. You shoot, roll, and throw grenades at your enemies from 8 different angles. Once you fire 100 shots, your ammo ends, but ammo boxes spawn for you to pick up. And sometimes temporary weapons with unlimited ammo drop and you can use them to your heart's content. That is until their timer runs out. Enemies can also drop health, grenades and dog tags. Once you've cleared a room, you have a few options to choose where to move to next. At the end of the level, you fight a boss and once you defeat it, you get a grade and access to a shop that trades the dog tags that drop from enemies for upgrades to your character and continues at a fairly high price, as you start with 3 of them and they are intended to be kept as a rare commodity. The reason why the gameplay is deceptively simple is that even on easy difficulty, this game is incredibly tough. With each level the difficulty ramps up, with the different enemies that spawn as well as the higher densities. Quickly enough, the game goes from being a simple check of spacing in between you and the enemies to some bullet hell level of dodge checks. It's like starting to play Call of Duty Zombies, but suddenly the game glitches out and now it's Toho. And now you must fight for your life, like you're a hamster stuck in a small cage with 19 others and you all haven't eaten for days. Regardless of the difficulty, the visuals are great as well as the soundtrack and sound effects, with one exception in the case of the sound effects being the sound of rolling, which to me at least sounded a little too similar to the sound effect of getting hit, which can be confusing when you're facing a bunch of enemies trying to not get hit by rolling, and can't really take your eyes off the incoming projectile to check if the heart being lost animation popped up over your head. Overall, much like it was the case for Micromages, this could pass up as a piece of lost media without many suspicions. Well, maybe except for the menus being too clean and giving way more options than the games at the time would give you. Xeno Crisis is definitely a great game, and can be a great time. but maybe it's not the best game for you to just sit down and relax, unless you're used to games like this. Stay on the Genesis, and still on the tough side, Tänzer. Released also in 2019? What was up with that year? The game is a horizontally scrolling hack-and-slash action game that follows the story of a ballerina that is the last survivor of an intergalactic plague, and had her body transformed to fight enemies of a post-apocalyptic world, and now travels through time to eliminate this plague. Tänzer gameplay is inspired by Strider and Osman, which was designed as an unofficial sequel of Strider. This inspiration is evident with the angled attacks that the player can perform and the jump arcs. The game allows players to triple jump, and eliminating enemies with a jump refreshes a jump, allowing for an incredibly fun skill ceiling with the use of jumps. This is enabled by the fact that the player won't be damaged by contact with enemies, and can only be harmed by enemy projectiles and environmental hazards. While you can definitely go from Ivy out middle through the connector like a speed demon, and you will probably feel compelled to do so due to the pace set by the techno soundtrack, doing so causes you to miss most of the coins that drop from enemies, which are important to collect, as with each level clear, you get access to a shop where you can trade them for upgrades, or even a save point to restart the game after you lost 3 hearts. And oh, yeah, this game has no continues. If you get hit 3 times, you're out and back to the menu. Which I won't show, as it might, no joke, be an epilepsy trigger for some. Each stage of Tänzer represents a different era of history, such as the Old West, late Roman Republic, the New Kingdom of Egypt, medieval England, the Portuguese Pombaline era, Japanese Muromachi period, the Viking Age, and the present, which is the future, in Saturn. Each stage culminates in a final showdown with a boss that represents something about the respective era, with the twist of the intergalactical virus. Overall, the enemy designs are fascinatingly weird and creative. The regular enemies designs are a little more generic, being different types of robots for the most part, but that should be expected with the limitations of making a game with limited space for the Genesis. The combat allows for a lot of player expression and creativity, with no real right answer as to how to defeat the enemies. One thing that is noticeable though, is that a lot of the enemies' attack patterns, especially the ones from bosses, feel a lot like the ones from bullet hell games. So they can become overwhelming at some points, and you will probably be finding yourself hanging for dear life on the last HP bar. But the patterns feel decently manageable, with some bosses even having blind spots that can be exploited. Tänzer is not by any means an easy game, but it's definitely a very enjoyable experience. The movement possibilities that the game allows are probably reason enough to give it a try, as even challenging yourself to stay airborne for as long as possible is very entertaining. Overall, a great game. Now lastly, we have the most recently released game of all dimensions, Project Blue. Released last year for the NES, Project Blue is a platformer obviously inspired by Mega Man, in a dystopic futuristic version of Hong Kong. A secret bioweapons lab conducts experiments on the young homeless people, and you, the most promising test subject, codenamed Project Blue, manage to break free, beginning your quest to take down the evil corporation behind this. The game controls are, you guessed it, akin to Mega Man's controls, with the game even sharing the mechanic of gained momentum affecting the angle of your jumps. Unlike Mega Man, however, you were given one gun and one gun only, with no variations available. You can shoot and jump just like Mega Man, but you must always be mindful that there can only be 2 projectiles on screen at the same time. So in situations that require accuracy, it's better to jump and manually shoot than to press the jump and shoot button. The enemy designs are relatively simple and repeat throughout the levels, including the bosses, But with the catch that as you go higher trying to escape this underground lab, they learn new abilities. My favorite were the turret enemies that learned how to jump on springs, turning the initially simple encounters with them into invitations for a quickscope only 1v1 on Rust. The levels were well designed with the enemies in mind, as the environment covers some of their weaknesses, while still leaving gaps for the player to solve the problems that they face, albeit making them tighter as the game progresses. The difficulty of Project Blue is somewhere in between moderate and hard, with the later levels spiking it up, but still far from being mind-numbingly hard. The continuous system is very generous. Should all lives run out, you will just be thrown into a checkpoint a bit farther from where you died. But the game is definitely not insanely punishing when it comes down to game over. Overall, Project Blue is a good game for fans of classic action platformers, especially Mega Man. It's simple and can offer a decent challenge. There's not much else to say about it. Retro games have found success and built their own niche market in the current scenario of video game development due to the overall disillusion with the practices that big gaming companies partake in. They don't have DLCs, battle passes, constant updates, or astronomical budgets. They don't depend on the approval of investors that would be quick to call for a reduction in expenses after the game didn't make them as much money as they wanted to. They are small passion projects, released when finished and often crowdfunded. They prioritize the soulful artistic aspects of games over the soulless corporate amalgamation that it has become to AAA companies. They resonate with those who find themselves discontent with the current market for games and wish to remember the good old times. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.